Hi everyone, and welcome to the very last episode of ngCopenhagen in 2021. We really wanted to have this event in person to meet all of you, and we had a lot of ideas how to have the Christmas get together. But yeah, unfortunately, because of the current situation, we decided to have this one online again. But of course, the health and safety comes first. My name is Sherry List. I'm one of the organizers of ngCopenhagen, and today I am your host. We might have Alexander joining us at some point as well, but we have an awesome speaker that I cannot wait to introduce him to all of you. But before I bring our speaker online on the stage, I just wanted to mention that we really want all of you to engage in the chat, talk to each other, tell us where are you right now, and ask your question because we have a Q&A session later at the end of the talk. And yeah, we want to have all of your questions in the chat. So, as for the topic for the day, as you notice, we have Micro-Frontends with the Module Federation and in-depth talk with Manfred Steyer, that many of you most probably met him at some of the conferences, or you attended some of his training, or maybe you met him even at NG Vikings. But for those of you that you never met him before, or you never heard of him, he is an Angular Google developer expert, and he is a trusted collaborator in the Angular team. And also, he often writes a lot of blog posts and also writes for publishers like O'Reilly or Java Magazine and windows.developer. So, please welcome Manfred Steyer on the stage with your virtual clap in the chat.
Hello.
Hello, good to see you back again in ngCopenhagen.
Yeah, same wise. I'm really happy I can be here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So, yeah, how is it going? Where are you right now, Manfred?
I'm currently here in Austria in the southeast, near the city of Graz. I'm sitting here in my home office and yeah, I'm doing a lot of remote stuff and this really works well. I was really surprised because I never wanted to do it, remote trainings and remote conferences. But for me, it really works well so far.
Yeah, actually, I was discussing with some of our other community friends that even though that is not good, that I mean, it's everything is remote these days, but it also enabled us to reach out to a lot of people that we couldn't reach before, and we couldn't have, for example, as you know, for NG Vikings, we could have people from all over the world attending to our conference, which otherwise we couldn't have such a chance. So there are good and bad part of it.
Yeah, the whole life is about trade-offs, isn't it?
That is true. That is true. Yeah. So thank you, Manfred. I'm going to share your screen right now. So I will go out of the way. I'm pretty sure that our audience cannot wait to hear your talk.
Awesome. So thanks again for having me. And let me switch to my slides. You should see my slides now. And yeah, this is about micro-frontends with module federation. And it's not a basic talk. I want to go beyond the basics. And for this, I want to start with a picture that shows, in my perspective, what micro-frontends are about. They are about slicing a huge application into tiny pieces. Normally, we slice according to business domains that are out there in your very business. And each of those business domains become one micro-frontend, one separately compilable, separately shippable micro-frontend. And we are not doing this just for fun, But we are doing this on purpose because we want to assign different themes to those different micro frontends. Those teams can work in an autarkic way. They can do their own stuff. They are really flexible. And when they are done, they can ship. They don't need to talk with each other that much. They are don't slowing each other down or breaking something of each other. Or to put it in another way, this idea brings back the agility of small teams. Small teams with, let's say, 7 plus minus people, even though you have a huge overall software system. And this also shows that this architectural style is first and foremost about scaling teams. It's not that much about technology. Of course, we need technology, but it's first and foremost about scaling teams. That means if you only have one team, you really need a very, very good reason to go with micro frontends. Because normally, if only having one team, you would go with one application. But if you have to coordinate several teams, then this is for you. Then this will hopefully lower more pains than it causes. However, I have a bad message for you. It's about your customer. Your customer is not interested into micro frontend. No, not at all. What your customer wants to have is one integrated solution. One integrated solution that is capable of everything they need. They are not interested into starting 50 applications each and every morning. And that's why micro frontends is about runtime integration. We have to grab all those pieces, all those micro frontends at runtime and integrate them in something I would call a shell. Something that looks like one single page application for your customer. And we really need to do this at runtime. We cannot do this at compile time because a micro frontend can be compiled and deployed on its own. So we don't know what's out there. We don't know all those versions up front. We only know the URL, and so we need to load them from this URL at runtime. This is one of the biggest challenges because so far there was not a good solution for runtime integration. Of course, we had a lot of dirty tricks and workarounds like working with iframes and loading web components on demand, but we needed a lot of tricks and custom code for this. However, since about a year, we have a rock-solid, straightforward solution, namely module federation. With module federation, you can easily import something from another application. For this, you are mapping those paths to other applications. And so Webpack knows at runtime, hey, when this path shows up, I need to grab a component or a module from this or that separately compiled and deployed application over there. This is what module federation makes possible. However, even though this looks easy at first sight, I mean, it's just an import, isn't it? There are some advanced topics. And they come up as soon as you are dealing with it in a serious way. As soon as you use it for a real-world project, those advanced topics come up. And that's why I will talk about such topics today. I will talk about version mismatches. What happens if we load two micro frontends using different versions of the same library? We talk about dynamic federation. What is if we don't want to know the micro frontends, their URLs up front? Perhaps we don't even know the number of the microservices up front we want to load at runtime. How can we make this very, very dynamic? What's with monorepos? Do they help? Or should we go with a multi-repo? Little spoiler, the answer is yes. You should go with a monorepo or with multiple repos. And the last question I want to answer is, how can we create a Frankenstein? Or as I also call it, how can we combine multiple frameworks and framework versions? I really like the metaphor Frankenstein for this because, yeah, obviously this is what Frankenstein was. Or at least the Frankenstein creature, the monster as some people call it. And to get everyone into the boat, I'm starting with a little tiny primer on module federation. No worries, only 2 or 3 slides to get everyone into the boat. Before I start, let me also introduce myself. I am Manfred. I'm a trainer and consultant for Angular, and I'm focusing on Angular in the enterprise. Angular for huge, large-scale enterprise applications. In this area, I'm doing a lot of workshops and consultancy. Nowadays, everything is done remotely, which, by the way, really works well. And besides this, I'm also quite connected to the Angular team. I always have to smile when I'm telling someone that I'm a collaborator in the Angular team, because in German, collaborating means teaming up with other people, which is great. Teaming up with other people in order to destroy something, to interrupt something, which is not that great. I know the meaning in English is a different one. And sometimes if I look on my pull requests, then I think, well, this pull request was more of the German meaning. Hopefully, more and more it reaches the English meaning. I live in Austria. I do a lot of stuff in Germany, and I'm always happy if I can work together with people around the world, which is quite easy nowadays because everything is done remotely. Okay, so let's get started with the primer into module federation. The basic idea of module federation is to introduce 2 roles. The first role is the shell. It's also called the host. The second role is the micro-frontend in our case. It's officially called the remote. It's remote over there, separately deployed. And now both roles can be configured with the Webpack configuration. For instance, the shell gets some URL mapped. Here we can say, well, the URL mfe1 points over there to something also called mfe1. It points over to a differently compiled and deployed application. And over there, the micro-frontend, the remote, can expose files. It can say, well, let's expose this Angular component or this Angular module, or perhaps just a function. Does not matter. Everything that works with ECMAScript works here. And of course, the shell is not interested into our paths. It is not interested that this component is found under source, app, my use case, my sub-use case, my sub-use case, my component. No, they want to have a short name. And that's why we have another mapping here. We map those internal stuff to short names. And then something beautiful happens. You will love it. Then all you need is not love, perhaps also love, but especially here a dynamic import. A dynamic import that is using the map names, MFE1 and CMB. And so Webpack knows, okay, I need to grab over there and get the component. The best of this is Angular does not even recognize that we are loading a micro-frontend. Angular does not even recognize. Everything Angular is seeing is that we are doing lazy loading. But Angular does not care where this component, this module, this function comes from. And that's awesome, because that means we don't need to tweak Angular. We don't need any dirty tricks and workarounds like in the past. We just use Angular as is, as it was intended to be used, and Bob's your uncle, as the British say. This really makes it straightforward. In former days, we needed meter frameworks orchestrating different Angular applications in the same browser window. Now, all you need is a dynamic import. All you need is lazy loading. You can also share libraries. You can say, hey, I have Angular core here. I have Angular core there. Let's only load it once. Let's only load it once and share it at runtime. Because it doesn't make sense to load it twice or to load it 10 times just because you have 10 micro-frontends. No, would be an overkill, I guess. And this is really as simple as one entry in your configuration. How can we use all of this? Well, if we used Webpack directly, we just needed to configure Webpack. But nowadays, we in the Angular community don't use Webpack directly. Webpack is hidden underneath the CLI, and so we need a plugin for the CLI. I've written such a plugin. It's not a big deal. It's about, 30 lines of code and a lot of boilerplate to make it possible to hook it into the CLI. You can ngEdit. This generates a Webpack config you can adjust. And then you ngserve everything. And one more time, Bob's your uncle. Let's have a look into this. I think having a look into this is important because all of this is a lot like the 1980s. You need to experience it in order to know what it is about. So let's have a look. So what I have here is a shell. And here I have my micro-frontend. It's within those red dashed lines. The micro-frontend runs on localhost 3000. The shell runs on localhost 5000. And when I'm clicking here, then the micro-frontend is loaded into the shell, even though it was separately compiled, separately deployed, even though it runs on a different origin. From Angular's perspective, this is just like lazy loading. You see it here. The bundle is loaded on demand, however, it comes from a different origin. However, this is not a prerequisite. Sometimes people are telling me, do I now need several servers? No. You can put everything on the same server. But the fact that it works with different origins clearly shows that we are talking about separately compiled, separately deployed stuff. And if we quickly look into our project, then we just see traditional Angular projects, everything as usual. They only have one additional Webpack config. We've seen it on the slides. And everything the shell needs to do now is lazy loading. Look at this. Everything we need to do is a dynamic import using the paths we've mapped with Webpack. And so we can grab over and Bob's your uncle. Oops. However, when you are starting with all of this, there will be several questions. And I'm quite sure the first question already arose, because when you saw that we can share libraries, the first question of you very likely was, well, doesn't this cause mass version mismatches? And the answer is, hell yeah. It can cause version mismatches. It can bring back DLL hell we had in Windows for such a long time. But the good message here is Module Federation got you covered. Funny side story, Module Federation was implemented twice because of this story. They had a first version of it, it went into beta, and then they figured that they need a better story for dealing with version mismatches. And so they completely re-implemented it to cover this story. And what they did was they included several strategies for dealing with version mismatches into the DNA of module federation. So it's really baked in. And they have even a very smart default strategy. The default behavior is just loading the highest compatible version. What a word. Highest compatible version. Quite abstract, isn't it? What does that mean? Well, assume we have version 10 on this side and version 10.1 on that side. According to semantic versioning, we only need to load version 10.1 because it's backwards compatible. A newer minor should be backwards compatible. So version 10 does not need to be loaded. Version 10.1 is shared. This is the default behavior. However, there is not always a thing like the highest compatible version. If we have two different major versions, we have an issue. In this case, you have 11 here, 10.1 there. A major version can come with breaking changes. And by default, module federation now loads both of them, which might be okay-ish. It depends. It's of course a hit on the bundle size, but it might be okay-ish if we talk about a stateless library. Think on underscore, think on RxJS. This part of the application is not concerned if that part is using a different underscore version. Each part gets its own version and they work with it, so it's completely fine. However, if we talk about a stateful framework like Angular, then this is quite a challenge. Then you need a lot of tricks and workarounds. Because Angular 11 cannot work with Angular 10 components. At least it's not guaranteed. And that's why if you really wanted to have two different Angular versions, you need to bootstrap all of those applications in your browser. You need to bootstrap this Angular application. You need to bootstrap that Angular application. Two applications running in the same browser window. You need a lot of workarounds for this. I will come back to this when we talk about the Frankenstein. But for the time being, let's assume we can avoid different versions of Angular. And trust me, it's the most straightforward approach if you only go with one version of Angular. Let me show an example for this. Let's assume we have version 10 in the shell and 10.1 in the first micro-frontend. In the second 9, in the third 9.1. Now Webpack is doing the math, and so it finds out that the shell and MFE1 will share 10.1 because it's the highest compatible there. And the other two will share 9.1 because it's the highest compatible one there. Quite smart, isn't it? Module federation really minimizes the amounts of versions we need to load. You can also configure a library as a singleton. In this case, you say, well, I want to have the Highlander principle, which means there can only be one, you know it. In this case, only one version of this library. Now, let's assume a conflict. Let's say the first micro-frontend has version 11, the other one has version 10.1. Because it's a singleton, there can only be one, the highest one will be loaded. Regardless if it is backwards compatible or not. That means if you do something like this, you are taking responsibility. Perhaps it works, perhaps everything is fine, perhaps you really have an issue. You can only find out at runtime. And that's why when going with micro-frontends, you need a sound set of integration tests. I mean, you need it anyway, but you need it especially here. Especially if we talk about going with micro-frontends. Because what does micro-frontends mean? It means runtime integration. It means we are switching from compile time dependencies to runtime dependencies. We are loading something we did not know upfront, and we can only find out if it works if we try it out. Hence, you need a sound set of integration tests. This is not specific to module federation. This is very specific to this architectural style. Better try it out. By the way, in this case, you get a warning like, hey, are you sure you know what you do? We are skipping version 10.1 and favor version 11. This might be an issue. Just a warning. If you want to have an error, a runtime exception, then you set strict version to true. In this case, we don't take prisoners. No, in this case, we just throw an error. We tell you, hey, something is wrong here. Look at your configuration. And yeah, this sounds a bit harsh, but at the end of the day, this is very likely what you want to have. Because this tells your integration tests immediately that something goes wrong. Fail fast is the theme. You can even relax the version. You can say, well, I know it was compiled against version 10, but hey, I'm an expert. It will work with everything between 1 and 11. But one more time, you are taking the responsibility here. Okay, let me show you a tiny demonstration for this. Let's break our application. I'm stopping my shell. I'm stopping my micro-frontend. And I'm moving into my webpack config of the shell. And here you see I'm sharing Angular core and Angular common and other stuff. And it's a singleton, a strict singleton. That means if several versions show up, I will get an error. By default, we are getting the versions out of our package JSON. This is what auto means. But now let's say, well, you are version 15. No, there is no version 15 currently, but this is the point. This will cause a conflict. Because over there in the micro-frontend, I'm doing exactly the same. I'm also sharing Angular core. It's a strict singleton, but here I'm saying, hey, I am version 12. And yeah, 15 and 12 is not the same. Hence, we will very likely get a slap into the face. Metaphorically spoken, of course. So let's try this out. ngserve here and ngserve there. And now this takes some time. This world is full of wonders, but this startup performance is unfortunately not part of them. Nevertheless, with some black humor, we can evade it. Come on. Yeah, everything is green. That means we can ship it immediately. Everything green here. The shell is loaded. The micro-frontend is loaded. And look at this. The shell shows us the hidden flag, white eagle on white background, which means something went wrong. And if we look here, look at this beautiful error message. I was never that happy about getting an error message. Version 12 and version 15 are not the same. We've configured a singleton, and so this is the greeting we get for the beta, because this tells our integration test, please double check. Okay, let's set it back to auto, which takes the version, in this case, from the package JSON. This is what this tiny helper is doing. Every time I'm writing auto here, it loads the version from the package JSON. By the way, you've seen it, I'm using a monorepo here. Using monorepos also avoid version conflicts, because at one time you can only have one version here. This might be another strategy. However, technically, you don't need to go with a monorepo. There are arguments for both sides. It totally works with separate repositories. It's really on you. Okay, let's talk about the second advanced topic, which is about dynamic federation. We've seen so far that we need to map our remotes in the configuration file. And this is really static, isn't it? I don't want to know about my remotes, about my micro-frontends upfront. I only want to know about it at runtime. Perhaps I want to ask the backend or a configuration file, hey, which micro-frontends do you have for me? And then it says, well, today I have this, and that micro-frontend. Please use it. Please provide a menu item for it. Hence, I really want to get rid of this here, of this remote entry, especially if we also need to hard code URLs here. URLs telling us where to find this remote. No, I don't want to have it. Let's get rid of it. And then everything we need is to switch out import for a helper function. This helper function is talking with Webpack at runtime, and it's telling Webpack to load something from over there using this key data. This here is the path pointing over there. This here is the remote name. And this here is the exposed file, CMP, for instance, for this component. And here we are just talking about strings. That means this can come from literally everywhere, from a configuration file, from a service call, could be randomized, I don't know, can come from everywhere, which really makes this dynamic. Yeah, this is a helper function. It's not an official function. I wrote this. It's part of the plugin. And it's basically talking with the Webpack runtime API, which is quite a low-level API. It's not fun to interact with it. That's why I've wrapped it away. Okay, let's have a look to a demonstration for this. For this, let's switch to my app roots. And here, let's switch to dynamic federation. I'm switching out the import for a call to load remote module. And here I'm defining my properties, exposed module. Well, perhaps we should go with it in the right order. It's not important, but it helps me thinking through it. Let's start with the entry point, which is basically the address of the remote. Localhost 3000. It's basically the address. The thing is, when Webpack compiles a remote, a micro-frontend, it emits a tiny JavaScript file with metadata. And this needs to be addressed here. Could come from a configuration file or from the server. Then we need the remote name, which was MFE1. And then we need the exposed module, which is module. It's not that creative. This gives us a TypeScript file from over there, or to be more precise, an down-leveled ECMAScript file. And this ECMAScript file has our Angular module we want to lazy load. So let's try it out. Let me restart everything. Because here I have still the version with the version mismatch running. Let's restart it. Yeah, it's blazing fast. Oh boy. And here we go. That was fast, wasn't it? So when I'm clicking here, then it's loaded one more time, but now it's dynamic. It's dynamic in a sense that we are just going with strings. And we could load those strings from everywhere. However, it's not dynamic, because I still need to know about this upfront. If it would be dynamic, we would not even know about this root upfront. So let's get rid of it and let's move to my app component. And here I've prepared something. Here I'm injecting the router. Here I'm dynamically creating my routes for the micro-frontends. At least we all can imagine that with some metadata, we can dynamically create this array here. And then we are adding it to the static routes. And finally, we are telling the router, hey, it's time to reset your config. I have a better config for you, the config that respects my dynamic stuff. This is everything we need to do. Just reset the router. And tiny hint, here I'm doing it in the app component, but if you want to tackle some issues with deep linking, move it to an app initializer. Then you are really on the safe side. In this example, it works, but in real world, app initializer would be a better idea, I guess. Okay, now let's try it out. Let's restart everything. And hey, it works, but now it's really dynamic. We didn't even know the route up front. And I think we all can imagine that it's not that difficult to also create those menu items dynamically. Just a for loop that creates all of them, pointing to the dynamic routes. Okay, so perhaps you're wondering if you should go with a monorepo or multi-repo, which leads to the third part of this presentation. And the answer is both is possible. The good message is both works. I've seen both working out there in the wild. However, as that often, both has its very own consequences. When we talk about multiple repos, then we are really doing micro-frontends by the book. Because the idea is to have strict borders between micro-frontends, to isolate them from each other. This is the idea. Because it should not be possible to grab over this border, to couple to something over there. Because if everything is coupled, we cannot ship it independently. We cannot deploy it independently. We need to talk with each other. We don't want to have this. That's why by the book, we go with multiple repositories. However, this brings some consequences, like to share source code, we need to use NPM libraries, which can be a burden, because that means we need to implement the library, assign a version number, ship it, integrate it into our applications. And if there is a bug, we are checking it out, the library, we are fixing the bug, we are increasing the version number, we are shipping it, we are integrating it again. And this goes back and forth until you are done or crazy, depending upon what happens first. So as you saw here, using NPM for project internal reasons is for sure not the last word on this. This is one of the costs that comes with multiple repos. Another thing is you could end up with version mismatches. You could have Angular, I don't know, 11 here. Let me use the pencil. And you could have Angular 13 there. Version mismatches. First of all, this is great, because first of all, this gives you the maximum of flexibility. But as we talk about single page applications, all of this needs to be loaded into your browser, and then those versions will clash. If you go with the monorepo, you don't have those issues. In this case, you are restricting yourselves to one version of everything, to one version of shared libraries, to one version of third-party vendor libraries, one version of Angular, one version of ngRx. Sharing is a piece of cake. And one drawback is you need to agree on one version. So it's an advantage and a drawback at the same time. However, I already hear you saying, well, what's about those strict borders we need to have? Those strict borders that avoid coupling, that avoid that this micro-frontend is coupled to the micro-frontend over there. Well, in this case, we could go with linting. There are linting rules for access restrictions, telling you, hey, you are grabbing into the wrong domain. You are part of the boarding domain, and you are grabbing over to booking. Don't do this. It's just a matter of configuring such a linting rule, telling the linting rule which parts of your software are allowed to use which other parts, and Bob's your uncle. And if you go with NX, which is really what I'm recommending nowadays, then you get a lot of CLI extensions, and one of them is taking care of access restrictions. So my recommendation, if you want to go this road, check out NX. This is not me in college, no. This is, the Frankenstein monster, the creature, as they call it. And this is what the fourth part here is about. It's about creating such a Frankenstein. It's about mixing and matching different frameworks and different solutions. So how could this be possible? Well, we've seen before that module federation allows for loading something from a differently compiled and deployed application. So far, we've talked about modules and components. But let's think one step further. Let's say we are loading a file, a main file, that gives us a bootstrap method. And when we call it, another single page application is bootstrapped in our index.ts. This would allow to load several single page applications into the same browser window. Of course, normally when a single page application bootstraps, it is looking up a root element. And this also means we need to create such a root element, which could be created with something like this 20-year-old DOM magic. And if we think one step further, we would just import a self-bootstrapping file. This is what most of the single-page applications are doing. They have an index or a main file, and this file is self-bootstrapping. It's the entry point to the application. Now we have another issue, because now we want to root in our shell to this or that micro-frontend. And hence, we need to wrap this logic into an Angular component the Angular router can route to. And now, one more time, Bob's our uncle. Now we can route to another single-page application within the shell. There are several challenges when you bootstrap several versions of Angular side by side in the same browser window. You end up with several challenges. And to solve those challenges, I have implemented this library. Look up the library. It's pointing to a blog article. Look up the blog article. It shows you all those nitty-gritty workarounds, dirty workarounds you need to go with to make this possible. But if you really want to have it, if you cannot avoid the Frankenstein, then you have this as the result. Then you have a situation where you can share libraries because of going with module federation. And you can load different library versions or different frameworks because you bootstrap each framework, each application on its own. You get the best of both worlds, but this road is very rocky. So really make sure you need it. And if you don't need it, don't do it. Let me show you a demonstration for this. In this demonstration, I'm extending our application with another route. And look at this. This route is not using a path, it's using a path matcher. A function that tells the router if this route shall be activated. This is one of those tricks. Because of this path matcher, I can just check if the route starts with React. Because if the application here, it's obviously a React application, comes with a React router, this React router is responsible for the rest that comes after React, that comes after this path. This is one of the tricks I'm going here. Another trick is I have this generic wrapper component. It can be configured with the data section, telling about everything we need to know for module federation, and about the root element, which is here just React element. And that's it. This and this comes from a helper library. Of course, you could also write it by yourself. Let's have a look here. Surprise. Yeah, that's really a surprise, isn't it? And React application in the middle of an Angular application. Online, I have a more comprehensive example. Sometimes this does not work. No worries, let's go further. Let's click here. Here I'm loading a React application. Here I'm loading another Angular application, but it is using another Angular version. So it comes with its very own Angular version, 12.03, which is also used here and there. But the good message is 12.03 is only loaded once and shared between them because of module federation. Here we have a Vue application. In my point of view, this really shows that we can mix and match technology. Here we have AngularJS. This shows that this architectural style can be nice for migrating away from an older technology. It allows you to migrate little by little, domain by domain. And here we have a dashboard. Hopefully you never have something like this. Several framework versions and frameworks on one route. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But it's good to know that it would work if we really needed it. Okay, so much about my Frankenstein. We are reaching the end of this. If you like this talk, then you will very likely also like my ebook on this. You can download it for free here, Angular Architects IO book. And if you don't like this talk, download it anyway. Perhaps I'm better with writing than with speaking. Let me come to a conclusion. What did we see today? We saw that there are several baked-in strategies for version mismatches. The best strategy is to avoid version mismatches. You can do this with a monorepo, but even though this is not possible, there are several additional strategies baked into the DNA of module federation. We've seen that it's all about runtime integration, and that the Webpack Runtime API even allows us to use dynamic federation. We don't need to know about anything upfront. We can load all the key data about our micro-frontends at runtime and then feed Webpack with this information. We've seen that the monorepo works, the multi-repo works. Both is fine, both has its very own consequences. With the monorepo, you are self-restricting yourself to one version. This is a restriction, but it also lowers the pain of version mismatches. And it's the other way around with multiple repos. It's a costly freedom. And we have also seen that we can create a Frankenstein if we really need it. This is about bootstrapping several single-page applications. Most of the times you're doing this for migrating away from a tech stack, or if you had a merger, if several companies need to bring what they have together for one common product. Okay, thanks for having me. Here you have all my contact data. I have already uploaded my material to my blog, and feel free to follow me on Twitter to keep contact. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Manfred. Amazing session as usual. And thanks for all the actually cool jokes that you made on the way as well. I really love them. And actually we got really good reaction in the chat from everyone as well. And we have many questions here. Are you ready for them?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, great. So let me scroll all the way up to get the very first question with our common friend Lars. So, hi Lars. So what he mentioned here is can you talk about testing strategies or techniques for Micro-Frontends?
Yeah, that's a good point. In general, you need a sound set of integration tests. When you have unit tests, of course, you need them too for other reasons, obviously. Then I would mock away everything that deals with runtime integration. Runtime integration itself is something I would test with integration tests. Integration tests, end-to-end tests. I usually use Cypress for this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mentioned it in the chat as well. This is actually a total topic can be covered in the whole talk, because testing strategies, they are normally need a in-depth kind of discussion about each scenario and so on as well.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Yes. Would be a nice further talk. Yeah.
Yeah. And the second question is again from Lars. And that he asked us, how is it the local development story for the module?
Well, most of the times you are just working on one front end. All those micro front ends need also to run in standalone mode without the shell, because they need to be compiled separately, tested separately, deployed separately. That means for the micro front-end teams, there is no big difference most of the times. Of course, sometimes you need to test it together with the shell, and then you need to start all the front ends up or deploy them to a server and look if the integration also works. And this is something I would do with Cypress or with some E2E framework in general.
Yes, that totally makes sense. And we have the next question from Jakob. And that he asks, how many teams do you think is needed before micro-frontend makes sense?
At least two. However, if you find out that those 2 teams, perhaps 3 teams, can work perfectly with a monorepo, then stick with the monorepo. It's far easier. For me, the micro-frontend story is really kind of a last resort. If you figure out that those themes cannot work in the same repository for what reason ever, or if you find out they are influencing each other too much, then micro-frontends are your friends. But until then, stick with a well-structured monorepo. The point is well-structured. I think on access restrictions that permit, that don't allow that everything is intermingled with everything else.
Yeah. And the next question is from Vimal. So how to deal with dependent module dependencies in module federation? For example, HTTP client module needs to be provided by consumer.
Yeah, that's true. So there are two pitfalls. One pitfall is this HTTP client comes with a secondary entry point. It's not Angular common, it's Angular common HTTP. And I always say we can share libraries, but to be more precise, we are sharing entry points to libraries. That means we need to mention this one here also in the shared section of our configuration. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, very often we have the case that the app module needs to provide something, for instance, by calling for root. And this needs to be done in the shell, because the shell now has our app module. Of course, for local testing, for standalone mode, we need to do it also in our app module in the micro-frontend itself, but the shell also needs to do it to provide those global providers. So import it in both.
Yeah. Yes. Sorry, I have to read all the messages as well, and then at the same time pay attention. I'm not a very multitasking person, so
neither am I.
And yes, the next one is again from our friend Lars. How about remote load options from user input?
Yeah, in theory it works. I did a nice example once. It was here actually on this user group. We had this snake implementation. It's a community implementation. Full credits go to the original author. And I tweaked it a bit. I implemented a micro-frontend based approach, or let's say a module federation based approach to control the snake. And then different people implemented different strategies for moving the snake around. And then we looked which strategy leads to which amount of points. And this was where the user input told the shell to load this or that snake strategy. So in theory, it's possible. However, the thing is, if we want to deal with version mismatches, then we should know the micro-frontends at the start of the application, because we need to load at least the metadata in order to find out who has the highest compatible version. We've seen it before. If one has version 12 and another one has version 12.1, only 12.1 is loaded. But micro-frontends and module federation needs to know this. And that's why they need to know this metadata on the start of the application. And hence, when the user input comes, this might be too late. If the shell always have the highest compatible version, then this is not a huge topic. Then the shell is just loading its own version, and as it's the highest compatible version, it will work with everything we are loading on the basis of the user input.
Yes, that makes sense. And I put that, we have the recording of the talk that Manfred mentioned on our YouTube channel. I put the link to the channel, and then you can just find the video. It's one of the last, I guess, 3 videos that we have. And the next question is, let me me scroll down a little bit from Mikai. What if your micro-frontends want to share state?
So technically it's possible. You only need to share a library with a service, and the service can act as a blackboard where one micro frontend is something writing on it and another micro frontend is reading from it. Or a better idea would be a service that acts as a message bus, which is perhaps just a service with some behavior subjects. Messaging is a very unobtrusive way for establishing communication. However, in general, you should minimize the communication because we are doing micro frontends in order to decouple our applications. They should not know much about each other because they are separately compiled, separately deployed, and different teams work on them. Hence, you will really try to minimize the communication to don't get back the coupling you wanted to avoid originally.
Yeah.
So don't share an nshare store. Share something simple with as little properties as possible.
Yes, that's a good advice. And we have Omar asking that, is it possible server-side micro-frontend with module federation, and what's the best approach?
Yeah, that's also a good question. In theory, it always was possible because module federation is done by Webpack, and you normally also compile your server-side code with Webpack. Technically, it's possible since this summer. In this summer, I adjusted the library. I created some schematics that auto-generate most of the things that make this working. So if you need this, check out my README file, and there is a section about server-side rendering.
Yes, great. And Lars, another question. What's your favorite animal and why is it sloth?
Yeah, so the sloth is the animal on my Angular book. It's unfortunately just a German book. I need to convince them to make an English translation. And there is a story behind this. Namely, back then, O'Reilly had different groups of animals for different groups of technologies. And for client side JavaScript frameworks, they had, do you call it primates, like monkeys and humans? Yeah, primates. And my co-author back then said, well, a sloth is a nice primate, and yeah, let's put it on the book. And yeah, so they did it.
That's a good one. And Lars, thanks for asking this question. So I will actually reach out to you later on. You win something from us for this question.
I don't think so.
So
there is the rumor that the publisher wanted to tell me that I never was in time with my scripts, and that's why they gave me the slot. But that's just a rumor,
That's it. Oh, and I can see. Oh, hi, Ayub. Good to see you there. Can you share a state with those micro frontend? Yeah, actually, we answered this one, Ayub. I hope you got your answer. Otherwise, write in the chat. So if there is something that you wanted to be covered in addition to what Manfred said.
Totally. To put it in a nutshell, it's just about sharing a library with a service that is moving the data back and forth.
And another question from Lars: what's your favorite pizza? And
yeah, once I did a talk about pizza. At least the metaphor was pizza. It was about web components. It's that long ago. It was in 2019, in March 2019. Yeah, and there I recommended Pizza Provinciale. I still recommend it nowadays. because of a very simple fact, a very simple reason. It's the best one.
Yeah, why not? And actually, now that you mentioned March 2019, it was the last time that I had an in-person kind of a big event where Anna's teacher was in Copenhagen, and that was the last in-person event that I had so far. Yeah. Good old days.
Good old days. They will come back, I'm quite sure.
Yes, I hope so. And Lars also mentioned, because somebody mentioned about the virtual kind of that gathering, and Lars mentioned all the networking before and after the meetups. So hopefully we will have it soon.
Yeah, that's actually the best of it. The hallway track,
Yes,
talking with each other.
that is true. And a good question from Jakob. That is Lars still your friend after all of these questions?
Of course, I'm looking forward to meet Lars again. I think last time was, don't shoot me, I think it was on ngBalland before the pandemic. I think it was in winter before the pandemic. Yeah, so it's about time to meet and talk a bit again. Yeah.
Yes, and we had a lot of kind of point mentioned here that thanks for the great talk. And we have one more question, I guess, from Omar. I have a customer who requested kind of Angular CMS app similar to WordPress to edit pages of his site. Is it possible to create it with Micro-Frontend, web components, and module federation?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. So if you talk about WordPress, I immediately think on a plugin based system. I'm loading, I don't know, a module for SEO, and I'm loading a module for managing events and for displaying news and for integrating Twitter. And yeah, this is what micro frontends are about. At the end of the day, a micro frontend is a plugin, quite a huge plugin, but technically it's just a plugin.
Yes. And I can see Ayub actually had a follow-up question about the kind of that his question that can you have different proxy config for different macro frontends when you want to share the state?
Yeah, what do we mean with proxy config? Do we talk about a network proxy that sits in between my client and my front end, or do we talk about the other kind of proxy?
Broadcaster, as you mentioned. So Ayub, is you're there, maybe you can clarify it. Otherwise, we can have like a follow-up conversation with Manfred later on.
But I guess in general, the answer would be yes. I always say if it works with lazy loading, then it also works with module federation. Because from Angular's perspective, it is just lazy loading. Angular does not know what's going on there.
Yes, that is true. I'm just browsing to see that if there are any questions missing here that or we answered all the questions. I would say that so far we answered all the questions. There are a lot of thank you messages and nice messages there for you. And yeah, thank you again, Manfred, for spending time with us, for sharing all your knowledge. I'm a big fan. I always love all of your in-depth talks, and you make it so simplified that when everybody listens, okay, now I get it. Now I get it. So you're a great trainer.
Oh, cool. I am glad to hear this. So thanks for this nice feedback. And yeah, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Great. Looking forward to see you in person somewhere again. And yeah, have a nice rest of December. And hope you enjoy the Christmas and holiday with your loved ones. And yeah, have a lovely evening.
Thank you. See you around. Bye bye.
Bye, everyone.